Hi all. Back to social studies, and before we jump into today's longer reading, I wanted to talk about Junipero Serra, who is really a very complicated person in California history. And we will be reading a different source after the vacation that is about a different perspective on this complicated time in California history. But let's read about Junipero Serra first from the textbook, the secondary source, and then we'll read the longer article over here about the missions. So Junipero Serra. I trust that God will give me the strength to reach San Diego. Even though I might die on the way, I shall not turn back. And this, if you jump from this star here, the asterisk down here, you'll see that Junipero Serra from the History of San Diego, the Explorers, 1492 to 1774 by Richard F. Porade, Union Tribune, 1960. Just shows where that quotation came from. So Miguel José Serra became a Catholic priest in Spain at the age of 24. 12 years later, he sailed to New Spain. There, he taught and worked with native peoples for many years. In 1769, he traveled to Alta California with Gaspar de Portola. Portola is how we say that in American English. And you might have heard, I mentioned this in the last reading, but these names, Portola, Junipero Serra, these are streets and famous places. Portola Valley is a famous place in California today. During the trip, he suffered from pain in his leg. Years earlier, he had been bitten by a snake or an insect, and his leg had never healed. Portola urged him to return home, but Serra would not. Today, Serra is known as the father of the California missions. Serra started the first California mission at San Diego in 1769. He started a total of 9 missions, which helped the new California colony grow. For many California Indians, the missions also led to the end of their traditional ways of life. So here you can see this drawing. Father Junipero Serra founded the mission of San Diego de Alcala on July 16, 1769, and you can see this cross here built out of trees. So this last line here is an important one, the end of their traditional ways of life. This is the end of the native Californians that we studied in class. The Chumash, the end of the Miwok, although there are still some, I believe there are still some Chumash groups active today. So this lesson is other kinds of settlements. Settle, meaning to stay in place, to sit down, and means to live somewhere. Let's take a look back at our timeline. We're here in history, so in the 1600s. In the 1700s. It's between 16 and 1800. So 1776, the northernmost Presidio is built at the mouth of San Francisco Bay. 1777, the first pueblo in Alta California, San Jose de Guadalupe, is settled. 1823, the last of 21 missions in Alta California, San Francisco Solano, is founded in Sonoma. We're not going to read this part. So the mission system. Starting in 1769, under the direction of the Franciscan priests, the Indians were forced to build a chain of missions in Alta California. These 21 missions were planned to stretch along the coast from San Diego in the south to Sonoma in the north. Each mission was about a day's walk from the next on El Camino Real. At the missions, the priests worked to create loyal Spanish subjects or supporters of the king. To do so, the priests followed a system or plan that had been used in other parts of New Spain. They would move the California Indians into the missions, teach them to be Christians, and show them European ways. Most missions were built near Indian villages or along Indian trails, so they could use the Indians as labor. These locations were usually near fertile soil and fresh water. In these places, people at the missions could grow the food they needed to survive. Each mission had a church, houses for priests and Indians, workshops, farmland, and pastures for cattle and sheep. Just want to pause because you might not have seen some of the earlier videos. I know this term Indians is controversial to say the least. And I do remind you that in class we learned that these peoples were calling them Native Californians. There are different terms for this word, but this is our book that we are using. By the late 1700s, the Franciscan priests had brought about 20,000 Indians into the missions. To attract Indians, the priests gave them glass beads and colored cloth. Often soldiers used force to bring in Indians. So here is a different kind of map of California. Here we are. Where are we? There's Oakland right over here. Here-ish. And you can see maybe San Jose you might recognize. There's San Francisco Bay. There's San Francisco. Oh, that's confusing. San Francisco is actually here. There's Santa Cruz, Monterey Bay, things you might know, Santa Clara. Maybe you know San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara. These are places I know. Maybe you know more. San Diego is what they've mentioned. This was the first stop. Anyways, all of these black dots here are missions. And these missions were church-like spaces that had a church, una iglesia, and different homes for the native peoples who were usually forced or bribed into entering. I have to pull back the camera so you can really see this. So let's look at this photo a little better. Whoop. Here is the mission. And this is that map I was mentioning. And here is a drawing of a model of a mission. And we can look here, sort of these numbers correspond to different places. So 1 being the river, okay? 2 over here are the officers' quarters. 3, I can't see 3. Maybe you see 3. Soldiers and guns and quarters. This is a good time to pause the video and take a look at this. Okay, so let's get back into the reading, the filming of the reading. And Presidios for protection. The Spanish believed that the missions alone were not enough to help them hold their claim to Alta California, so to control it, to be conquerors. As in other parts of New Spain, they built forts called Presidios to protect their settlements. Pause. Have you been to the Presidio in San Francisco? Good place to go when we can ever leave our homes. In Alta California, the Presidios were often built on natural harbors not far from missions. Soldiers at the Presidios could defend the harbors against attacks by enemy ships. Presidios near missions could also help protect missionaries and other settlers from attacks by Indians. The first Presidio in Alta California was built near San Diego Bay in 1769. It stood near the mission on a hill overlooking the bay. Later, 3 other Presidios were built in Alta California near the missions at Santa Barbara, Monterey, and San Francisco. All the Presidios were built by Indian workers and in much the same way. Each was built in the shape of a square and had an open courtyard on the inside. The buildings included a chapel, storage rooms, workshops, sleeping areas for soldiers and their families, and a house for the commander. At first, the Presidios were very simple structures. The early buildings of the San Francisco Presidio had dirt floors, window openings without glass, and very little furniture. When British Sea Captain George Vancouver toured the San Francisco Presidio in 1792, he said that in cold and wet weather, the soldiers' house must be uncomfortable dwellings. I remind you, this asterisk shows this comes from a real primary source. The soldiers at the Presidios had many duties or jobs. They hunted, worked in the fields, cared for the livestock, built and repaired structures, and delivered mail. They were often put in charge of Indian workers. Just going to pause for some water. At times, the Spanish and the California Indians had conflicts. Soldiers at Presidios sometimes had to stop Indians who fought against Spanish rule. The soldiers had guns and rode horses. The Indians were poorly armed and had to fight on foot. Interesting note on the battles. Just 2 more pages of this one. So, pueblos for farming. The soldiers at the Presidios needed a supply of food. To meet this need, farming communities called pueblos were started. In Spanish, pueblo means village. In 1777, Felipe de Neve, the governor of Alta and Baja California, gathered soldiers and their families from the Presidios in Monterey and San Francisco. Near the southern end of San Francisco Bay, they built a small settlement called San Jose de Guadalupe. It became Alta California's first pueblo. And I'm just going to pause here because you can still go to this pueblo, the first pueblo in Alta California, and you can go to San Pedro's market, and there's a market that's been built around that pueblo. Maybe you've been there already. That same year, Neve chose a spot near Mission San Gabriel for a second pueblo. In 1781, a group of 44 settlers established a pueblo that would later be known as Los Angeles. The next pueblo, Santa Cruz, was built in 1797. At the center of each pueblo was a plaza. A plaza is an open square where people can gather. Important buildings, such as a church, bordered the plaza. The people in the pueblos often had Spanish, Indian, or African ancestors. In the pueblo that became Los Angeles, for example, almost half of the original settlers had Native American ancestors. 26 of the first settlers had African ancestors. While many of the people were farmers, others were store owners or craft workers. Each pueblo also had an alcalde, or mayor, who also served as a judge. Spanish leaders hoped that the Pueblos would attract new settlers to Alta California, but few people wanted to live there. It was a long, hard trip to reach California from most places in New Spain. There were few roads and no large towns or cities. Yeah, we talked about this in yesterday's video, but like I showed you on the map, California is surrounded by mountains. It's one of the 5 regions of California that we studied, and it makes it really difficult with the Pacific Ocean on this side and the mountains all around. It really makes it difficult to get to California. The Spanish wanted to encourage settlers to travel to the Pueblos. Many of the new settlers were rewarded for their efforts. They were given land, farming tools, farm animals, and money. In return, they had to sell their surplus or extra crops to the soldiers at the Presidios. By bringing people to the Pueblos, the Spanish hoped to strengthen their claim to Alta California. However, the population of Spanish settlers grew very slowly. By 1781, only 600 settlers, mostly men, lived in all of Alta California. That just makes me curious. You know, how many people live in California today? How many people? How many people in California? 39.56 million as of 2018. And you take a look at this, California's population, 1769, they said there were 600 people here. This is not even 2,000, maybe 1,000 people in 1781, 1821. I wonder who they were counting, though. That might not be fair. Maybe they weren't counting people in a fair way. But here, 3,000, 7,000, and now we have 39.56 million. Unbelievable. Let's look at some questions. How is the Spanish mission system in Alta California organized? Question number 1. And this is an important one. How did the Spanish hope to use Pueblos to strengthen their claim to California? Why were Pueblos important? And I think that's it for now. So I hope all is well. And have a good one. Bye-bye.